Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Kevin Adams, and you're watching The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
And right on cue, Don Frazier shows up. Hey, Don, welcome to the show. Let's get Kevin on the big screen here.
Right.
So,
how are you?
This is so much fun. I love doing this. And here's the thing is I get to talk about a lot of different topics. And today we're talking about history and race and class and ethnicity and all these other things, especially in Kevin, the frontier world, you know, the big Western states and how we had to figure out how to sort it out. And it fascinates me because you have all these characters all coexisting at the same time. And you just start to realize how impossible all this history, and also every book that Don writes is like the bloody history of this, the bloody battle. It's always bloody everywhere because it was a dangerous time to be around. And then Don Frazier, of course, has been the guest a couple times on the show. Don is also a historian, also focused on the frontier. And I thought we could have a great conversation, and you two especially could have a better conversation than I can have when we talk about our modern approach to history as we try to sort out ethnicity and race and class and what these things meant. And then, you know, you guys both know this. This is more for the audience. You know, you have to know history, be able to layer it, contextualize it, to be able to, you know, you have to read the letters so you can be like, actually, you know, what we want to be true today wasn't even possible, you know, back then, whenever it was, right? We had Joe Posnanski on the show the other day, and he's a really notable baseball writer. And we were talking about the different eras in baseball, and we often stop at the color line being broken. But Japanese players still aren't a norm. The Caribbean players started to come in, but we don't talk about that line. How about the line before antibiotics, before ligaments and tendons could be put on bodies? How about taking a player from today who you think is better and put him back where the shoes, the cleats would be dress shoes with nails through them, and they would Danny McLean was noted for smoking like 2 packs of cigarettes a day and drinking 30 Pepsis a day. I mean,
doesn't make him a bad guy.
Right, doesn't make him a bad guy, but he definitely, you know, that's not something that you would see today. It seems impossible today, and that was just in 1968, not that long ago. So that's a long preamble, but I just thought the audience might appreciate like how we're going to try to go about this. And so, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, fantastic. I'm happy to be here. And let me just say at the beginning, history is complicated. This will be the keynote. It's very complicated. And that's the virtue of it, right? Because we can sort of rethink our assumptions about the past and past people. So,
yeah. And then, Don, do you have any thoughts at all on this the extended preamble that I gave?
No, I think it's great. And I'm pleased to meet Kevin in this context. Absolutely. He represents kind of the generation behind me. And so we may do a little bit of inside baseball discussions about the biz and, you know, graduate school and stuff like that. I've had a great relationship with Kent State. Isn't that where you are currently? And with the Civil War history, the Journal of the Middle Period, I'm, you know, back in my early days, that was kind of the journal that you wanted to go toward. Y'all still run that as well, correct?
It is. It's right out of the Kent State University Press. I was associate editor from 2010 to 2015. It's vibrant. It's lively. It has a competitor now in the Journal of the Civil War era, but Civil War history, for my money, is where it's still at in the field.
Yeah, and so I've spent a lot of time prowling frontier military posts in Texas, and spent a lot of time thinking about the U.S. Army in this part of the world. So mine's a little more localized. So I'm anxious to learn something today. I am your pupil.
All right, great, fantastic. Well, let me just say at the outset, Texas is actually one of the blank spots in my book. I could have done a lot more because Texas is a very complicated place. If history is complicated, Texas is even more so.
Yeah, you need to call me, Kev.
That's good. We've already
made it. We can do that. We can make it work.
You know, one thing I always like to point out with these kind of chats too is that like the history of, say, Texas or Ohio is millennia old. I mean, the guys out here in San Diego at the Natural History Museum found an elephant that has human carvings on it that date back to, you ready for this, everybody? 100,000 years. So if there are people here 100,000 years ago, we haven't found the beginning of time, because you didn't just show up and start butchering things. And so what we know about history, and then when history slides into paleontology and archaeology and all these other things, it's really limited. I mean, we can go back. I know nothing. I know a lot about World War II, and I know nothing about it. I mean, there's so much to grasp and get a hold of. Now put me back another 100 years, and I'm basically a babbling idiot, when it comes to this stuff. And even you guys are talking about holes in your knowledge and just the capacity to tell the story that you want to tell. And it's like, I don't have enough pages to get into Texas. It's just too complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and like, I often find that even something I know best, the Army after the Civil War in the West, the more I know, the more I realize I don't know, right? There's just gaps in the record. There are questions you hadn't thought of. I think to study the Army after the Civil War, you have a wealth of resources that you don't have for other historical topics. Officers wrote a lot. The National Archives are fantastic. There are hundreds even of accounts from enlisted men's perspectives. But for all that, we're only seeing a small percentage of the folks passing through that institution. And in terms of their daily lives and interactions, it's even less of what we're capturing. So we're doing the best we can, but it's an inherently challenging endeavor.
I agree. And even then, there's just miles and miles of miles and miles. Yeah. And people a lot of times don't really get their arms around how vast the American West is. Yeah. I mean, all you got to do, my gosh, just take a road trip sometime. And it is just mind-numbing how many miles you'll cover with not a whole lot to look at. And I think that part of the perception of working in the post-Civil War Army in the West is how do you take something so vast with so many moving parts and make it compelling in a way that it can stand up against more swashbuckling tales, further east and in different time periods.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a subject where I think American culture does a good job of sort of making the Indian War kind of a staple of our history, right? But if you look at the post-Civil War Army, the amount of Indian wars, the number of deaths are actually fairly low. There are many years where there are no deaths between the Army and Indians, which raises some interesting questions about how expansion and conquest happens, and maybe it's not as military as we think.
Correct. Yeah.
But for all of that, the amount of the distance is unbelievable, right? We're talking about the Trans-Mississippi West with an army of maybe 15,000 people asked to garrison it, right? And I always tell my students, because here I am in deepest, darkest Northeast Ohio, right? And they think of everything west of, the Ohio state line is the West, really. Like, look, if you're going from Cleveland to San Francisco, halfway is Western Nebraska.
Correct. Yeah.
Right? So that's 1,200 miles, right? So like, you got to kind of try to break down those sort of that geographical ignorance. It's really challenging. Yeah, it's a vast area, not a lot of troops, and a lot of challenges confronting soldiers. So it was a very interesting time to study the Army.
To the point on the distance of things, it is 1,400 miles from Houston to Port-au-Prince. It is 2,200 miles to Seattle from Houston. Yeah. And these are dramatically different realities that are in this space. And then, when you look, like, I'll probably see Dawn this summer. I'm going to go out to Big Bend National Park, which is right next door to Big Bend State Park. And these things in themselves are enormous. I come from the Bay Area, and I think about Sherman, getting on a horse and riding from Monterey to San Francisco, or San Francisco into Benicia, my hometown, and then out into the gold country, and how long that would take, and how arduous that journey would be too, and how easy it is to get sick and die. And then at the end of the day, I'm going to go write something, and my letter, I promise, is not going to be like, "Oh man, I was at my worst today, Mom. Boy, did I screw everything up." And I saw some people, and I didn't like them because I didn't like the color of their skin or the culture that they It's hard to suss that stuff out.
And sometimes you have to parse it out too, and essentially precipitate it from the sites themselves. One of the things that we ran into at Fort Chadbourne was a number of mirror writing examples. So, you think about, gosh, what happens if you were severely dyslexic in 1875? What was the mechanism by which you could be in society? And we're working with a hypothesis that a bunch of these guys that were doing graffiti on the inside of the ruins of Fort Chadbourne were actually dysgraphic, and they were just writing everything backwards. And there's just so many things like that. I'm glad to see the kind of research and scholarship about the warp and weft of the fabric of the society that produced this Army coming forward. Because, my gosh, it's not just race, class, and gender. It may be learning disabilities. It may be all sorts of things going on. So, but the Army's still a pathway for social mobility, unless I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I like your point, Don, about sort of thinking about location and place, right? I think those forts captured a lot of the values of that society, just the way they were laid out and built, right? If you look at a parade ground, the difference between officers' row and enlisted men barracks, right? They occupy different spaces, literally, right? And like most posts actually have kind of a working side of the post where they have the stables and the gardens and the bakery and where the enlisted men hang out, and then kind of a sort of a part that's administrative and for show and for officers, right? And those worlds often would not intersect at all in a way that would really surprise us. If we think of like the modern military where like leadership is shown by your willingness to kind of pitch in and work alongside the men and relate with them. Like that was not true in 1875 at all. The idea was you were a gentleman, you were sort of educated, you were different than the enlisted men who were often you perceived as people who were willing to desert, commit crimes, be drunks, and so on and so forth. So it's some of the most anti-military voices in the period I study are actually officers themselves who are disdainful of the men who they served with. It's a really different world than the one we live in.
What's the Wellington quote? Scum of the earth enlisted for drink.
Yeah, you know, and that's and everyone reads Kipling, right? When Kipling talks about sort of the British Tommy dying on a forgotten plane, he's capturing a real reality and a real kind of dismissiveness towards those enlisted men who volunteered basically for years of service and to be forgotten in the middle of nowhere.
That's certainly the case with the Union Army in South Louisiana, which is what I've spent a lot of time researching. They are very their life is very cheap along the Chaffalaya. And so those officers really look at their men in aggregate. They don't think of them as individuals. So it's interesting that tradition that we see elsewhere in the world is certainly played out in an American context.
I find it in official military reports from the 19th century, if an officer is killed in battle, you know their names, you know the disposition of their remains. And they'll just say like, oh, 20 privates were killed. Like there's no attention to them or what happened to them. And then like in sort of like the period that I study, when there are battles and conflicts, they do everything they can to take the bodies of officers back east and to retrieve them from battlefields. They usually just bury the enlisted men on the site, right? And put some rocks on and hope the wolves don't tear up the remains. I mean, there's just no attention to that sort of the personal lives of soldiers and the private soldiers in the way that we are used to.
Yeah.
Is that, would you say, is that, and I know I'm going to try to put something in a tiny box, but is that more driven by class, like the officer class and people who became officers were connected, had money, that kind of thing? And I want to add this element in too, because John Langolier wrote that great book about Powhatan Clark. It seems like the people that weren't bookish but could go to West Point, you know, ended up in these crappy assignments out west where like promotions were slow and the work was dangerous, but also spent a lot of time sitting on their butt in a courtroom going to court martial.
Yeah. So I think if you're looking at that kind of those patterns, right, I think we have to trace it back to the 18th century and sort of what we inherited in terms of our military tradition from Great Britain, right? So the notion of officers as aristocrats is really a British conceit. We inherited their military structure in many ways. You see it in the Revolution with the treatment of officers and enlisted men. There's a really good book by Carolyn Cox called A Proper Sense of Honor, if you really want to trace out how officers and enlisted men lived side by side in that war. But I think that sort of notion of officers as gentlemen, which is not just a phrase, it's built into the sort of congressional statute. It embodies the values of the officer society. That's really important. And West Point only furthers that. I mean, this is an era where most officers go through West Point, which is really an engineering science school, even more than a military school, right? The tactics and they don't learn how to lead platoons and companies in the field at West Point. What they learn are classic military theory and how to build basically fortifications for sieges, right? But that kind of education makes officers proto-scientists, proto-novelists. I mean, they're sort of intellectual jack of all trades in the Victorian era. And they see themselves as distinct from the rest of society. Yeah, no, it is definitely an elitist bent to it. And that carries out and I think influences a lot of how the Army operates on the ground.
Big difference between being commissioned and enlisted.
Yep, absolutely.
I mean, receiving a commission versus just merely being enlisted.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And like, it's instructive, I think, to compare like the oath that an enlisted man takes when he volunteers for service in the U.S. Army and the sort of the officer's commission. But for the enlisted men, the keynotes are basically obedience, right? Obedience to your commissioned and superior officers. Enlisted men, officers, when they are commissioned, a whole set of values attached to that commission that don't attach to enlisted service, right? Enlisted men are typically seen as drudges. They receive very little military training. It's assumed they're not going to be there for 20 years, that they're likely to desert, that they're prone to crime. And so you get an institution which is like really riveted by these divisions, these class divisions, and its very sort of origins, right? Its very foundations. And what that does is, I think, as my book tries to show, is that it encourages enlisted men to think of themselves as a class, like maybe not a class in the Marxist sense, but as a group with common interest against officers who have a distinctly different and opposing interest, right? And what's interesting to me is that those enlisted men in the 19th century are overwhelmingly foreign-born, African-American, folks on the margins, people who, if they live in cities, are at each other's throats oftentimes. But in the Army, we don't see much evidence of that kind of ethnic animus at all. We do find race, obviously, but Germans, French, Americans all sort of band together as sort of enlisted men under the thumb of military oppression.
They've got a common enemy.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
When you look at something, from that era, from the late 1800s, where you guys specialize, and in this impossible mission, I think about my time in Afghanistan working with the Army and an economy of force mission, right? So Fort Huachuca, bigger fort, but Fort, fill in the blank, is not. And so you can't buy off on every single thing that walks in the door or every fight that is offered. You have to really be picky and parsimonious with your men, because you have to bake bread, you have to maintain the force, you have to do all these things, and then send out these small bands of dudes. And the last thing you want as a commander is to have your entire squad destroyed. Yeah. And it's always remarkable to me, in the movies there's unlimited ammo, but in real life, fellas, quit shooting so much. We're gonna run out of food and ammo in a minute here, Well,
and that's like in my book, there's a year where the Congress doesn't appropriate appropriates enough money for target practice where everyone can shoot like 3 rounds a month on their single shot Springfields, right? They're not zeroing their weapons, right? Assuming they even know how to use them properly, right? What's striking about the post-Civil War period is you have a couple hundred forts or camps, right? Often they're one company posts, right? So like the middle of nowhere in Texas, right? Or Montana, you've got 30 guys. Like, if that's the federal sort of, if that's the embodiment of federal power, it's not a very powerful government, right?
That's deer camp.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and okay, so we have a bigger post. We have a 3-company fort. That's 100 guys, and at any given time, a certain percentage are sick. They're on detached service, and so on and so forth. Officers were famous for going on recruiting service back east and just not returning to the regiments, right? And you could see why. You're stuck at Fort Stockton for 5 years, maybe, right? You're a long way from anywhere, and your wife doesn't want you to live there, and so on and so forth, right? So, yeah, I actually like the Afghanistan comparison in the sense that you have to make choices, right? You had to make choices, and it made lower-level officers diplomats of a sort, right? Because they're not receiving direct guidance from headquarters very rapidly. So they have a lot of discretionary authority when it comes to dealing with local problems. In the same way, if you're in a valley in Afghanistan, though today, of course, the communications are different, a lot still falls on that young captain's shoulders in terms of navigating the waters, as it were, of civil military strife. So yeah, no, there's the old book, Robert Kaplan's book, which is now 20 years old or so, Imperial Grunts. I think these officers and soldiers were in many ways they're embodiments of the federal state with a lot of weight placed on their shoulders in very trying circumstances.
What are some of the misconceptions that we have about race, ethnicity, and class in terms of how the frontier operated, especially with the Army? I mean, it's easy. Look, we often just we go black or white on problems, but geography matters. If you were a dude raised in some kind of a plantation-friendly area, and you get sent off to New York to go work with a bunch, and all of a sudden now you're out in the West where you're encountering daily, Indians. You got black folks. And by the way, the Buffalo Soldiers, these are guys that are like, when Greeley said go west, it's like if you got some guts, go west, right? Like if you don't, you stay home. And so you do have this and this is Pete guessing, this self-selective adventure kind of route that pushes dudes out. And so you got these guys that are out there willing to go out and ride with limited ammo, with limited food, with limited resources in 100+ degree temperatures.
Yeah.
That's not milk toasty dudes. These are hard ass guys. And if you've never encountered them before, it takes a minute to sort all that out.
Yeah, so I think one big challenge of like trying to read race and class back in the military past is that in this period especially, historians traditionally have seen the isolated from American society. There's a very long tradition of arguments saying the military is distinct, it's separate, it's kind of outside the norms. And I don't think that's true at all. I mean, all the soldiers and officers came from an American society. They had imbibed American culture and American society and its sort of standards. And they took them into the military context and reworked them and played around with them. In terms of like those soldiers moving west, I think what drives that in
we got, looks like Kevin's frozen.
He
Dom, are
is.
you there?
I'm here.
All right. Well, we'll cover for Kevin while he's
on the margins of northern life looking for jobs. And
we
so
missed about the last 30 seconds of what you said. Could you repeat it? It locked up on your end.
Oh, sure. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So there's always going to be a subset of guys who are desperate looking for jobs in the context of the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, right? An era of depression, recessions, no social safety network at all, right? So you could literally starve. And so the Army in any given year has probably 4 times as many applicants as they have slots open for enlisted men. And what you get are people, I call these folks basically the day laborers of the northern industrial economy. These are often recent immigrants who don't know English well. These are folks who are young, who haven't found a trade yet. These are people who may be alcoholics and lost their families. And so they're going to recruit and join the Army because it promises food, a small salary, $13 a month for a private, but at least they can be secure. And once they get transferred west, you could desert, sell your weapons, and sell your labor in a Western context where there's a shortage of manual labor, make lots of money. Oftentimes you see the country and figure out where you might want to settle when you get out of the service. So there's a lot of stuff driving that kind of recruitment, that motivation for service. But they were, I think, by any standard, remarkably tough people who had to make it on their own, right? These are not people who had it easy. Right. These soldiers, these enlisted men had tough lives, and they were pretty hard scrabble individuals.
And if they were fresh off the boat, they were leaving a pretty hard scrabble context too. So, hey, life in the Army with 3 hots and a cot beats digging potatoes south of Hamburg any day.
Yeah. Yep. And if you're talking about like Germans especially, you're getting the period where there's the universal military service is coming into play, coming online in many European countries. So it's a familiar environment for a lot of guys, German military forces for a while. And so this is not it's a place they could settle in easily and do 5 years, which was the term of enlistment in the 19th century.
And with American officers, they're going to at least treat their rifleman, their average private, as a human being, which may not be the case in the Prussian military.
Yeah, no, we would find the 19th century, the standards of discipline in the Frontier Army, we would find them to be sort of shocking, but in the context of 19th century military service, they're actually fairly lenient. Yeah. Most of the Army's work is done by non-commissioned officers. Officers are supervisors. They stay aloof and removed from the actual practical realities of daily service, right? Officers write reports. That's what they do, lots of. They write novels. They write papers on Indian policy, You can find evidence of hard-charging officers who are out there willing to go on scouts and to fight wars and all that. But most of these officers, if you think about it, they're in an institution where there's very little promotion. They were often occupying higher ranks in the Civil War, like someone like Custer, right? General in the Civil War. All of a sudden after the war, he's a lieutenant colonel with no real direct command responsibilities, right? Custer's only in charge at Little Bighorn because the colonel of his regiment's on detached service, right? Yeah. And so for a lot of these guys, post-war life was a step down, and they are bored, they're frustrated, and they're happy to live on very generous salaries and create their own very fancy world of leisure and entertainment and all that stuff as a way of coping with a pretty depressing professional existence. I mean, if you're a major for 20 years, how tiresome would that be, right?
Well, it's a frontier constabulary, right?
Yep.
So there's kind of a police function that you also have to pursue, and so that's adds to the tedium, but also kind of gives you something to do. I'm amazed that the way that the enlisted men at these posts out in West Texas are essentially an extension of the domestic staff of these officers. And so you run into documents, you know, all right, we sent Corporal Corncob and a couple of other guys up to Abilene to fetch the captain's wife's piano. So they're going from San Angelo to Abilene with a wagon so that they can put a piano in the back of it that just came off the train in Abilene and drag it all the way down to Fort Concho. And I'm just thinking, wow, that's I don't think that would fly these days. If you had, you know, some captain at a local base that was using his privates to go pick up groceries at HEB for his wife.
Yeah, not that it doesn't happen, but yeah, no. In the 19th century, right? That's when we say officers are gentlemen. This is one really tangible example of that, right? The notion that officers are entitled to personal servants is just it runs everywhere. And if you look at the way these officers' homes are built and how they lived in them on these frontier posts, the surviving examples we have, you can see there are servants' quarters, servants' entrances, right? By law, officers were not supposed to employ enlisted men as servants after 1870. In practice, though, this is happening regularly. They need servants to kill the chickens. They need servants to black their boots. In part, they can't find domestic servants who are usually women. They can't find many people willing to travel from New York City to Fort Concho. And so they use enlisted men as a sort of a stepping stone. But and this is one of the resentments of many soldiers, right? The idea that I came here to be a soldier, and here I am organizing cutlery in the pantry of the captain is a recurring complaint of enlisted men, right? They feel that they were victims of a bait and switch.
Yeah.
When we look at the modern sense too, a lot of these things you guys just said still resonate today. If you're an officer and you get sent to Afghanistan to a remote post, you're like, hey, you know what? I just found out that I've been reassigned over to Jalalabad, you know, whatever, somewhere far away, right? Over to Kabul or Kandahar. Also, you might get reassigned. Like, that guy has no business being out there. We're going to swap him out. But it's possible to limit your exposure to risk for the vast majority of your career as an officer. So as a captain, sure, you're going to get a company. You can be the kind of company commander who stays on your company post. And these guys often, don't to be unfair, they're often better at managing their career because that lieutenant that's like, get me the hell out of here. Yes, I will go take this impossible job. You know, those guys are too far removed from the flagpole and they don't work on those things. And it's easier to push them out. And by the way, if you got a badass, you can take 10 dudes and go out and go hunt Indians for 5 months. You know, that guy's handy. You don't necessarily see him as someone who's promotable because they're not doing the things that get promoted. That for sure is still a thing. But in general, a lot of these things like the go ahead.
Well, I would say this. So the 19th century Army's answer to that very real issue, right, of trying to sort of people who are close to the flagpole and being promoted, it was very simple. Promotion was by seniority, right? So up to the level of a century general, you were promoted simply by hoping someone above you died or left. And so what it does is it promotes a really interesting professional culture, right, where there's not much incentive to be a hard charger or to study because your professional fate depends upon factors which are completely divorced from military competence, right? So you wait for that captain above you in rank to die so you can be promoted from second lieutenant. I mean, by the end of the frontier period, 1880s, 1890s, they're creating personnel files for the first time. They're doing assessments of officer service. But creating a regimental promotion system takes decades and is, so it's just a very different institution where guys can sit around and be a captain for 25 years and do nothing professionally and do just as well as someone who is the hard charger, who's accomplished things, who tracked down Geronimo, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very interesting institutional response to the question of promotion. Not necessarily the best response, it's just a different response.
Let me ask you a question about the book you haven't written yet.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does all of that, is there a shadow of that system that plays out in Cuba and the Philippines in the sort of next generation?
No. So I think one of the basic distinctions in American military history that's often kind of bypassed is the distinction between sort of regular army and sort of state volunteers militia, right? So
Sure.
Philippines, Cuba, one of the major challenges is trying to integrate lots of folks from like basically civilian life into the military structure quickly with frontier officers who are often old, out of touch, and not combat savvy, to put it lightly. Yeah, so there's if you look at the histories of some of these individual officers and their experience in the Philippines and Cuba, you often find out, oh, so-and-so went to Puerto Rico, was involved in the invasion, and 3 weeks later came back because of health reasons, right? There's a real tremendous shuffling of kind of old and decrepit officers out of those frontline positions. And the people who replace them tend to be like the people like Leonard Wood, people who grew up in a military which was professionalized in the 1890s. And they're the ones who are really going to be the leaders of the institution through World War I in the 1920s, people who came up in a very different military. But a lot of those senior commanders in sort of the Spanish-American War were manifestly unfit for health or other reasons. And I don't think the book has been really written on that command sort of shuffling. You could do some interesting stuff looking in the aggregate of these careers, right? And seeing, what percentage of folks actually persist in command beyond 6 months. But it makes the Spanish-American War is a disaster in a lot of ways. And this is one of the issues that really bedevils the American forces.
Yeah, it's often overlooked.
And plus and you throw in like a million brigadier generals of volunteers, right, from random states who know nothing about the institution. And so it's just chaos. And that's the same way I think about the Civil War too, right? I mean, I'm doing a project now on Civil War courts martial and working with some colleagues across the country. And I always try to tell my colleagues who are Civil War historians, like, look, no one knows anything about military law, military procedure, right? So these courts martials actually tell us more than we think, because it's basically a bunch of amateurs making stuff up on the fly in their sentences and their decisions, right? And that's, we know that the Civil War had some bumps in the military side because of inexperienced officers, but I think it persists much more than just in combat. It's like every aspect of the institution suffers from having people who don't know what the hell they're doing.
Go ahead.
I'd say it always strikes me as odd when you read these kind of histories, how permissible murder was. Like, oh, well, you know what? He did threaten him, and because he had a gun, he shot him, and so they're like, what are you going to do? And so the gray area, and I know it's funny to say like everything's great, but really, truly, you could have the exact same murder situations, and depending on who you're sitting there, you could walk out a free man or get strung up and hung. It's crazy how lawless that law, even in the military, how lawless the law was.
So if you've been following the debates about what to do with the prosecution of sexual assault in the military, right, and should you remove the discretion of sort of courts martial, it's very much to me a 19th century debate, because that's the issue, right? You could have two people desert and do the exact same thing and receive vastly different sentences from the court that they happen to sort of sit before, right? There's a lot of discretion given to these officers, and I think Don's point, this is a frontier constabulary, is really essential. These folks are essentially appendages of the local sheriff. They are actually doing domestic law enforcement. They're protecting the boundaries of national parks. They're doing all kinds of sort of things we wouldn't see necessarily as military today, and that involves a lot of kind of, you need to have officers who have a lot of good sense to navigate those sort of local centers of power. Otherwise, you have problems.
Any examples of officers getting fragged in your research?
So there's an account I think I put in the book, but maybe it got cut out, where Nelson Miles, who was not very popular as a general for a number of reasons, I think it was the Nez Perce campaign, and they're fording a river, and Miles is fording the river, and there are some bluffs, and you can't see the other side. And so enlisted men across the river start shooting their guns in there to freak him out. And they start to cry that the Nez Perce are nearby, just to cause him, just to frighten him. That was a humorous account. I want to say there are some allegations of sort of, soldiers firing through tents and on a couple of occasions. But I can't think of any sort of fragging instances in sort of the Vietnam era parlance.
Sure.
In part, though, officers don't necessarily lead from the front, right? And so it's really those non-coms and their groups of 4 who are kind of creating picket lines, skirmish lines, and kind of guiding things. So harder to get shot in the back when you're already behind the lines.
Yeah, when you can't see the guy's back.
Yeah, that's right.
I ran into a pretty interesting fragging situation in South Louisiana during the Civil War. That's why I was asking.
Yeah.
And, so you had this general that came in, and he was a bit of a disciplinarian, and the troops under his command were essentially the same guys we saw in that old movie, Gangs of New York. You know, just kind of pushed into the military and sent down to South Louisiana to check off a state quota. But these guys are real ruffians. I mean, they are bad hombres, and they're depredating on the locals, depredating on each other. And so this general starts trying to crack the whip and put them in back into order. And they take it out on his brother. This general has a brother that's on his staff who's running courier work for him. And they ambush him out in the woods and just smoke him, just shoot him dead. And they essentially investigate the case and decide to write it off as an attack by Confederate guerrillas, as opposed to rounding up the perpetrators who they could identify very clearly. Got a bunch of guys from Rhode Island. And said, you know, instead of rounding these guys up and stretching their neck, we're going to say the Rebs did it, but y'all talk it out because we're not going to have this going on anymore. Meanwhile, there's a dead lieutenant floating face down in the bayou.
Yeah. I think when I answered the question, I was thinking about sort of battle, but actually, if you're going to find those kinds of episodes in garrison, there's a lot of chance to steal things from officers, attack officers. You have more opportunity to do things against officers in garrison than on the field of battle. Sure. And I think, and this is where, you know, if someone had the time to go through the tens of thousands of courts-martial files in this period, you would find some really amazing stories along those lines, right, of enlisted men striking officers, trying to attack them. We know enlisted men had very little respect for non-commissioned officers, because if you look at the way the Army works, there are so many crimes committed by enlisted men. Sergeants are often broken down back to the ranks, reduced to the ranks regularly, right? So it's common that in a company, you know, a third of the privates had already been non-coms at a previous part of their military existence, right? So there's a lot of disrespect of authority on that level. But yeah, no, a lot of the if you read the literature, a lot of the sort of the big scandalous attacks on officers are made by other officers concerned about honor, right? Because they're gentlemen, right? So it lies about their reputation, their family, and that sort of thing. Their performance in the Civil War. They produce voluminous correspondence, courts martial at times. There's a famous circular, I think, from Sheridan or Sherman, where he says essentially, I have enough to do without having to intervene in every personal dispute in the Army between officers. So just knock it off, right? But the fact he has to write that tells you what officers are doing in their spare time.
I wanted to ask you about the, you know, our history with the Native people is really conflicted. And we also have a conflicted history with Black folks. But there's also a lot of other people that have been persecuted and judged along the way too. But let's just focus on Indians and Blacks for the moment in the frontier. Yeah. Is it, first off, did anybody, we have this conscience now and like we want to see people be good to each other, but did that even really exist back then? Did people recognize, I mean, because up until fairly recently before this, Black people were, by almost everybody, looked as being like a lower caliber of person. I mean, this goes all the way back to Aristotle, right? So how do you see the balance between Black, Indian, white, and then the opportunity to realize, hey, we're a lot more similar than we are apart. We're a lot more capable than we are.
Yeah. So I'll start with sort of Black soldiers, talk about that experience a bit, and then move to the Indians, because I think they're slightly different categories of analysis there. So we don't know as much about Black soldiers as we'd like because of a lack of sources, right? We don't have a lot of primary sources written from the perspective of Black enlisted men. We have a fair amount on the experiences of the handful of Black officers who often have their own travails that they go through. People like Charles Young, Henry Flipper. There's a whole literature on some of these guys are railroaded out of the Army, so on and so forth. So the creation of black regiments after the Civil War, we tend to see them, oh, look, we created this segregated elements, right? The U.S. Army was segregationist, it was racist, so on and so forth. In the context of the 1860s, though, I think this is actually a progressive reform in the minds of the people who created those regiments, right? These are radical Republicans saying black men have earned the right to citizenship through their Civil War service. We should recognize their loyalty to the Union. And oh, by the way, they're probably going to be cheaper. I mean, this is an important part of the congressional debate. They're going to be cheaper because they're less likely to desert. And it's true. If you look at the frontier period, actually, the desertion rates for black troops are much, much lower. Is it because if they ran away, they'd be easier to catch? Maybe that's part of it. But I tend to think that for the blacks, for the black enlisted man, the Army represents a career in a way it doesn't for white enlisted men who see this as a job, right? So the institution itself, there's a debate which has gone on for a while about whether the Army was sort of institutionally or structurally racist, and if so, to what extent. From my perspective, and there are folks who know this literature and these sources better than me, but I think the placement of the black regiments in the Southwest tells you a lot. Places like Arizona, West Texas, these are seen as like the margins of the American civilized universe, right? These are terrible places, far removed from cities, with the toughest jobs. And white regiments regularly rotate state duty station from the east to the Midwest, the West. Those black regiments are left essentially out there for 20 plus years because it's just easier to deal with them that way. There are no problems with white civilians. I mean, this is why Texas is really important because of the Reconstruction era context of having black soldiers in a former Confederate state, fighting Indians, but also helping to sustain civil government. But I think if you're going to look at the Army as sort of institutionally racist, I think the placement of black troops gives us a hint as to where black people were seen in the minds of the policymakers. There is evidence that if you're black and you fall sick in the Army, you're more likely to die. Well, you're less likely to be seen by a doctor, and when you are, you're more likely to die. I have some of that data in my book. I've gone through the Surgeon General's records. It's a vast disparity. The West, though, in a sense, though, does offer and promise an amount of freedom for black folks you don't find in northern cities or the South, right? I mean, there's a lot of literature in the history of the American West on sort of black refugee colonies in places like Kansas, the famous exodusters. I mean, so it's kind of a mixed picture. And I wish we had more from the perspective of black folks, because the challenge we face is telling a story about race primarily through the eyes of white policymakers with their own vested interests, right? So I still think there's a good book to be written by someone on how does the black community in the 1870s and 80s respond to the Buffalo Soldiers, right? What are black newspapers saying about those folks? That research hasn't been done. I would be curious to read that book. And if I had more lives, I might be interested in actually writing it at some point. But, you know, we only have so much time. In terms of Native Americans, I think this is something I've been moving more and more into, right? If you read my book, you're not going to get much in the way of actual fighting between the Army and Indians, right? I mean, a lot of other folks do that work. My book is really kind of a social, cultural history of that institution. But more recently, I've been thinking deeply about Indian policy and sort of the Army's role and all of that. It's really complicated. In terms of race and sort of what did people at the time say, there was a very vibrant and active reform movement, Friends of the Indian, who were concerned that federal policy towards natives was unjust, immoral, inefficient for a variety of reasons, and injurious to Indians. Those folks existed. But the sort of like what we might call the progressive or sort of left-wing approach to Indian policy was in essence not much different than the sort of approach of many locals in the West. Even progressive reformers believed that the salvation of the Indian lay in assimilation, right? No policymaker thought that letting Indians live like Indians was a viable option, right? So if we're thinking about the role that race matters, that's where it matters, where basically the Friends of the Indian, quote unquote, their aspirations rested in the sort of the phrase, kill the Indian to save the man, right? Now, is that cultural genocide? I mean, those are debates I think are a little bit academic and sort of I'm not particularly interested in or engaged by them. But I do think it tells us a lot about American society that's as far as the progressive sort of sentiment went. I mean, I tell my students every semester now, like, look, we're on native land, right? Let's just recognize that we're on native land. Now, how that happened, why it happened, how it played out, that's where we debate and have real discussions. But I think that's an important starting point to recognizing that history of conquest and expansion, and trying to sort of engage with its legacies. And it's really hard in a place like Ohio, because the narrative here is that Ohio was vacant. There were no Indians here when settlers showed up. And of course, that's completely false. But Americans are very good at telling themselves stories about Indians that make us feel better. Including the story that we're all somehow related to Cherokee princesses, which is very common and almost never true.
Yeah, wasn't the biggest military disaster at the hand of natives just down from where you are?
Yeah, in the 1790s, right? Yeah, no, that's right. So there's a whole series of failed expeditions launched by the U.S. Army in the 1790s. Colin Calloway's book, The Victory of No Name, covered that ground in the past 5 years or so. And I think that's an interesting way of framing we think of it as the defeat of the army as opposed to a native victory, right? But yeah, no. And sort of my big point on sort of conquest, since I kind of alluded to it earlier, is that the army is in no position to conquer and kill every Indian in the Trans-Mississippi West. It's too small. It's not militarily effective. If we're trying to explain why Native Americans lost sovereignty in many ways, it's about the expansion of American settlers, people who are often at war with their own government, right? Oklahoma is a great example of that. But people who paid no attention to reservation boundaries or sort of treaties, who were willing to sort of do what it took to grab land. And those are the folks the Army is often at war with, trying to preserve federal land from settlers and failing. And that's, I was invited to talk a lot about the January 6th insurrection last year. I was on a number of shows because of my work on the Army, and I write on federal sort of local tensions. And yeah, the sort of little known narrative of American history in the 19th century is kind of ordinary citizens at war with their own government when it comes to sort of land policy. And we haven't, I think, embodied that and embraced that reality as part of our narrative. We tell ourselves other stories which are happier.
Let me ask you something, since you brought up the indigenous peoples and their attitude towards all of this.
Yeah.
You know, there was a brief flirtation with reservations in Texas in the 1850s.
Yep.
And so I was able to identify some of the Comanche leaders, the Numina leaders, that were essentially being romanced into either going on the reservation or not. And ultimately, there was this sort of political economy going on.
Yeah.
And one particular leader would say, look, if we go along with this 3 hots and a cot plan that these white guys are telling us about, your children won't cry during the winter. You know, all of a sudden, life is going to get good. You're not going to be eating skunks and rabbits anymore. Trust me. Yeah. Then you had the other leader saying, look, if we resist this, we can live like we have traditionally, etc. Yeah. So how much of that sort of native eclipse in the late 19th century was voluntary by essentially some of the indigenous people saying, man, I'd much rather live in a place that has a pitched roof that doesn't collapse if we get too much snow, as opposed to living out in the windswept greasy grass.
Yeah. No, Don, I think that's a really important point. So I use this in my classes to illustrate sort of what we call agency, what historians call agency, right? Everyone has a choice to make, has an opportunity to make choices. Correct. Those choices are usually constrained, right? And so for Native peoples, the choices are often trying to make the best of a bad situation. What's the least bad option, right?
What's the least bad option?
Yeah, and without knowing, without having complete knowledge of all the factors that contribute to that, right? Yeah. My sort of, I think where the literature shows is the political economy is really important for Native societies. And by the time the United States becomes an independent nation, in many parts of what is now the United States, Native peoples' political economies had been warped by the introduction of European trade goods, and sort of a European settlement. And they'd been reshaped in really dramatic ways but before the United States even shows up. And so when we have Native peoples debating best options, reservation life or independent life, I think it's important to recognize that they were talking about societies which had already been dramatically shaped and in many cases weakened by European trade and settlement. And then there's a large literature on, for example, the introduction of alcohol and the introduction of, say, for example, European metal goods, which have become essential in daily life, but which require constant procurement of skins to trade for more metal goods and so on and so forth. So those societies in many cases had already were facing severe constraints by the time the decision to settle on reservations or not. And then you get things like in many Native societies, warfare is a way to establish one's manhood and become an adult. So the factionalism between sort of older Native peoples, older generations, and younger men is always really problematic in some cases. That's why if you're interested in the Civil War, studying the decision of sort of the quote unquote 5 civilized tribes to join the Confederacy is a really illuminating and I think instructive window into that Native decision making when faced with really serious challenges to their sovereignty.
Sure.
Do either of you think, was there a path, like we often are very critical, and rightfully so, of George Bush and his decision to invade Iraq and everything else. However, who would have sat at the tiller and made a better decision? I mean, Al Gore, and that's just not political. It's just not possible to make a good decision given what we knew at the time, right? Mm-hmm. You know, we often get mad at Christopher Columbus or whatever. We don't ever talk about Cortez or anybody else that was, we just, I'm mad at Christopher Columbus. But we never ever study or talk about the discoverer, the explorer who gets whacked by the locals because they take a softer approach, right? So, was there an out with the Indian folks that was actually possible in the time? Was there like, oh, if only Bob Smith had survived, he had the pathway out? Like T.E. Lawrence, great, but he's 100 miles away from any influence to actually get a real Arab solution. So. Are we being a little bit hard on ourselves and understanding that just how impossible that problem was, or was there a viable, better path that would have been available to these folks?
Whoops, there's my phone here. Let me turn this off here. Being the chair of a department has problems. That's right.
Heavy is the head that wears the crown, friend.
That's right. So, yeah. I think, so let's speak of the post-Civil War period, right? Say 1865, 1890, right? I think given the constraints of American culture and the realities of American settlement on the ground, it's hard to envision a radically different outcome for Native peoples. Like, I don't want to be stuck saying this is inevitable because I think that's not how historians usually operate. If we say things are inevitable, that kind of inhibits actual analysis and study, right? But it's hard to find voices of significance arguing for a different outcome. I mean, the assumption from all parties was that expansion to the Pacific coast was not only good, but actually essential for the country's future, that Native peoples were obstacles to that progress, that Native peoples may die out, and that they had no future unless they became essentially middle-class Americans. And so it's really tough. I think where the history could have played out differently, if you look at before the Civil War and the first days of the Republic, the treatment of, say, white squatters by the federal government opens up space for ordinary Americans to feel like it's their birthright to just take Indian land. And so a more robust federal response, I think, would have mitigated some of the worst excesses. But it's just really hard to envision a 19th century America where an important group of policymakers say, you know what, I think it's okay to let the Lakota Sioux be the Lakota Sioux, right? Like, we don't need Montana. Like, that's not important to the American. And so, like, I don't like saying it's inevitable, as I said, but I think it's hard to envision an alternative outcome. In the same way, perhaps in 2001, it's hard to envision an outcome that doesn't involve Afghanistan in some way.
And how do you accommodate a raid and trade culture in a rule of law context?
Right.
Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said, look, these guys can't raid into Mexico anymore. You're a problem. Yeah. So what do you do about that? Yeah. When I was teaching a course on the indigenous peoples, I would have my students challenge them as a class exercise to come up with a different Indian policy.
Yeah.
About the time they started wringing their hands and, being upset about things, said, hey, look, you got to play it out the way it played out then. So you've got the answers. You go ahead and give a different Indian policy. Do we turn Wyoming into a big drive-through safari park? What do we do? And it's a big problem because you don't want to come off as being uncaring or unfeeling or racist or some other label. But it is a huge problem with how you reconcile essentially an industrial society with a pre-industrial society. I wouldn't say Stone Age because they're well past that. But each of these indigenous groups have already lost their culture with the first contact. So their culture has been modified the first time a skillet appeared in camp. And so that said, you know, what's the inevitable end of that process?
Mm-hmm. And I think like Oklahoma provides a good window, a test case of this, right? That was the Indian territory, right? And that land was supposed to be sacrosanct from white settlements. And the way that the sort of the settlement of Oklahoma proceeded, I think, is instructive for thinking about the federal interest and the federal capacity to shape that history, right?
Sure.
For me, when I think of the 19th century military, it's really, I think of it as a constabulary. I think of it as a essentially jack of all trades federal agency. It does things like intervene in labor disputes. It protects national parks. It blazes trails. It conducts scientific expeditions. I do think that the military was generally pretty effective in focused interventions, right? So if you study the history of, say, Reconstruction, when you put the Army in South Carolina and say, okay, stop the Klan and bring people to trial, you know, bring them up on federal charges, it can do that. Doesn't mean people will be convicted, but it can establish law and order pretty reasonably well. Yeah. The challenge is sustaining those operations, right? If we're talking about this as a military issue, sustaining operations, sustaining political will, the challenges we faced in the global war on terror recently, right? Those things were just as present in the 19th century, and they limited federal action and effectiveness when it comes to Indian policy. There just wasn't a constituency saying, we need to sort of beef up the Army to protect Indian rights. That just didn't exist. Yeah. That's anachronistic.
When we look at these problems too, the political science part of our discussion has to happen. So if you don't have a fledgling and growing federal influence, you know, with these picket line of posts and everything else, and the actual postal service establishing that there is a government there, that and you know, like if you had a wall at Oklahoma and said that's Indian land, and you had a wall at Montana, well, then that can also enable the Blackfeet to go, you know what? This is when we're going to push this way. And, you know, humans are just going to take over stuff. Like land's getting scarce. We're going to take more. The Mexican government and military might say, hey, the Americans are soft. We're going to come in here and we're going to take, you know, there's all kinds of power ebbing and flowing with these plural political economies and what happens. And again, this you don't want to say it's inevitable, but there's a lot of complexity to do this. And at some point, you know, you have to flex your muscle if you've got it, because talking often stops being effective.
Yeah, and I think, you know, native societies will ally with American power or oppose it at different points for different reasons, right? These things are fluid. They aren't set in stone, right? It's a challenging topic to kind of wrap your head around, because it touches upon a lot of really important and powerful historical forces that are hard to reverse, right? And we don't necessarily want that to be. Where I come down, like when I teach this, I always use a collection of primary sources called Our Hearts Fell to the Ground, How Plains Indians Viewed the Loss of the West. For me, what I want students to get out of it, where I think Americans should think about, is sort of what are Native people saying? What are their voices, right? Because we tell the story from a perspective which is based in Washington, right? Our whole history education at a certain point is an exercise of filling out the map of North America. And showing, oh, here's the Gadsden Purchase, right? Here's Louisiana Purchase, right? That's how we're socialized. That's the story we tell ourselves. And I think, especially today, it's important to think about other interpretations, other stories that might complicate what we inherently and kind of unconsciously learn, right? And that's, I think, where the scholarship is moving, and that's exciting. It doesn't change that history, but it gives us a new way of thinking about it. And I think it gives us some insight into thinking about sort of Native peoples today who live in the worst corners of the American landscape in terms of things like public health and economic progress and so on and so forth, right? I mean, this history isn't unfinished. We're still living it, right? We just don't see it in those connections.
The third world in the first world, as they say.
That's right, yeah. And you know, and Native peoples retain sovereignty in a way they don't in, say, the British imperial possessions, right? One thing that's interesting about American Indian policy is it allowed tribes a political formal role in governance, which doesn't happen in the British Empire at all. If you look at the history of New Zealand, right, they're not bringing the Maori in to help govern New Zealand. Right? They're not giving them a formal voice. It's exterminating people, right? And so for all of its flaws and sort of injustices and immorality, there is retained a smidgen of Native sovereignty, which becomes more powerful in the 20th century as sort of political winds blow and so on and so forth.
What's the phrase? The domestic dependent nations, or dependent domestic nations?
Yeah. It's like an example of where you see how power really operates. And like Pete, your point about the political science context, right? Let's think about plenary power. And the Supreme Court says, well, you know what? We actually don't have to follow any Indian treaty if we don't want to. Right. If you want to see where power matters, right? It's not about like rational argument or fairness, right? And so Indian peoples have been sort of suffered at the short end of that stick for as long as the United States has existed. But it's important to be aware of that and to think about how we might change that.
And again, what path existed to make a different thing happen? I'm curious if that Henry Flipper, and I'm not sure what his role would be to his community as a pioneer from the point of being like the first West Point dude. But is there a Eugene Sledge book out there from some Buffalo soldier or some Indian guide that we should be aware of? And or is it possible to still discover a manuscript in someone's grandma's
optimistic.
locker?
Yeah, I'm optimistic we'll find more stuff. If you're looking for a book length account, we don't have that, but we do have a good collection called Voices of the Buffalo Soldier by Frank Schubert, which has a collection of editorials in black newspapers and occasional letters and so on and so forth. There's a poem, for example, about Wounded Knee told from the perspective of 9th Cavalrymen. And what's interesting is like, if you're a black man trying to prove your citizenship and loyalty, maybe one way to do that is like killing Indians, right? Like maybe you see this as an opportunity, right? And those kinds of complexities play out in that source book. But in terms of like a Eugene Sledge, a coherent individual narrative, we don't have that, unfortunately. But I would recommend that Schubert's Voices of the Buffalo Soldier is a good way for listeners to kind of like, dabble in the sources and think about that history for themselves.
I like it. And also the piano quintet in A major is also wonderful too from Frank Schubert. just a little classical music jokes. Hey, Don, if you want to comment on that or just give us your last thoughts, I want to get on to the next thing here and don't want to take up too much of both of your guys' time. But so Don, any final thoughts?
No, that was I've learned a bunch today. I always like being in the room with very smart people, and I feel like I've been in the room with very smart people today.
I love it.
Fantastic.
Kevin?
Well, those who like my book, who are interested in learning how soldiers actually lived, you'll get a lot of that in my book. It's not a history of Indian policy, but we'll tell you about how soldiers and officers lived, what they thought about each other, all the sort of things about daily life that make us interested in daily life are there. It's a story which is still not completely told. The 19th century Army is often sort of a dark ages in American military history. And I think there's a lot to be seen when you look at that institution. It tells us a lot about the society as a whole. So I hope you'll give it a try and let me know what you think.
Yeah, for sure. The link is right there, you guys. And if you're on listening to the podcast side, it'll be in the show notes. The book is called Class and Race in the Frontier Army Military Life in the West, 1870 to 1890. And I'll just say this, we don't got to comment on it, but it's really fascinating when you read these histories from this era and you know what's coming. Flight, gasoline, horses being obsolete. All this stuff is right after 1890. Like it's right then and everything is changing. And so everything we think is important and real is about to get smashed in about one generation. It's just fascinating. It's a great time.